Welcome back, Bourbon Hunters. Excuse me if I sound a little nasally. There's some things going around here in Southern Illinois that have definitely caught on in the entire household. So excuse me again for not jumping on camera because I look like I just fell out of bed or out of a tree and just kind of rolled around on the ground. Today, we're diving into the dark side of your favorite spirit: the fires, floods, lightning strikes, tornadoes, and warehouse collapses that literally wiped out millions of barrels of bourbon. That's right. Some of the rarest bottles you're chasing today only exist because entire rickhouses died for them. Sometimes I just randomly think of things and I end up reading and reading until I'm satisfied with what I've found. Well, today I'm bringing you along for the ride, sharing the wild, fiery, and sometimes wet history of bourbon disasters with all of my fellow hunters. We're talking about Heaven Hill's River of Fire, Buffalo Trace going full hazmat, Maker's Mark barrels taking a swim, and even Old Crow nearly disappearing in the 1800s. These are the disasters that shaped Kentucky bourbon forever, and the flavor profiles, allocations, and legends you see on shelves today. So pour yourself a dram, grab a chair, and let's get into it. Trust me, it's going to be one hell of a ride. Heaven Hill's fire in 1996. We're coining this the night the sky caught fire. This happened in Bardstown, Kentucky. They lost over 90,000 barrels, and that cost is equivalent to over 7 million bottles, let's say. On the evening of November 7th, 1996, a violent electrical storm rolled across Nelson County. At approximately 9 p.m., lightning struck Heaven Hill's warehouse, one of their aging rickhouses perched on a hillside just outside of Bardstown. That single strike did not merely ignite a fire. It created a chain reaction that would become the most destructive bourbon disaster in modern history. Warehouse 1 immediately erupted into flames, and within minutes, internal pressure from the superheated alcohol vapors caused barrels to rupture. Burning bourbon poured out of the building, ran downhill, carrying flames directly into adjacent warehouses. One by one, 7 Heaven Hill rickhouses ignited in sequence, like falling dominoes soaked in gasoline. What followed looked less like a fire and more like a volcanic eruption. Entire hillsides became rivers of burning whiskey. Fireballs, some described as the size of pickup trucks, rolled downhill as barrels exploded and were launched from collapsing structures. Local creeks and drainage ditches literally caught fire as flaming bourbon poured into the water supply. Residents reported hearing continuous explosions as barrels detonated under extreme heat. The inferno burned so intensely that the sky glowed orange for miles. Windows rattled across town. Emergency responders were forced to evacuate surrounding areas. Fire was visible from orbiting satellites. Firefighters could do almost nothing but watch, because water could not suppress burning ethanol at that scale. By sunrise, 90,000 barrels were gone. More than 7 million bottles worth of aging bourbon simply ceased to exist overnight. These were not young barrels. Many of them were aging into what would have become Elijah Craig, Evan Williams vintage stocks, bottle and bond reserves, long-aged experimental barrels, and multiple future limited releases that never even got names. Entire future product lines were erased before they could exist. This is why collectors still talk about the lost Heaven Hill stocks. Some legendary dusty bottles on the secondary market exist specifically because they are survivors of a generation of whiskey that no longer exist. Heaven Hill did not just lose whiskey, they lost time. You can't rush aging. So the company had to buy aging stock from competitors just to stay afloat, change their release schedules, adjust barrel placement strategies, rebuild aging inventory literally from zero in some categories, and completely redesign their rickhouse spacing and fire prevention engineering. This fire is the reason Heaven Hill's modern rickhouses are spaced farther apart. They use improved lightning protection and have different airflow strategies than pre-1996 designs. Some of the bourbon you drink today, including certain batches that feel mysteriously amazing, are influenced by blending decisions that were forced by this catastrophe. Because of this event, Heaven Hill permanently lost a decade future supply. Some age-stated programs had to be scaled back. Some barrels were blended earlier than planned. Some releases were reformulated entirely. Certain rare releases today exist only because they were protected stock that survived the fire. Every time a Heaven Hill bottle disappears from the shelves faster than expected, there's a very real chance the supply mass still traces back to November 7th, 1996. This was not just a fire. It was the night bourbon history permanently changed, and Heaven Hill is still rebuilding from it, almost 30 years later. Buffalo Trace's tornado in 2006. The storm that rewrote allocations. Location, Frankfort, Kentucky. Date, April 3rd, 2006. The storm rating, an F3 tornado. This affected Buffalo Trace, the oldest continuously operating distillery in America. On the evening of April 3rd, 2006, a powerful F3 tornado formed west of Frankfort and carved a straight line path directly through the heart of Buffalo Trace Distillery, a site that had been producing whiskey continuously since before the Civil War. The tornado did not graze the property. It went straight through the aging grounds. 7 historic rickhouses, some over 100 years old, were hit head-on. Entire buildings were peeled open like soda cans. Roofs were ripped off. Support beams snapped. Thousands of barrels were thrown, crushed, punctured, and ruptured across the distillery grounds. More than 4,000 barrels split open, releasing tens of thousands of gallons of aging bourbon that poured directly into the surrounding drainage systems and into the Kentucky River. The alcohol contamination was so severe that oxygen levels in the river plummeted. Fish kills were reported miles downstream as ethanol displaced dissolved oxygen in the water. The spill officially triggered environmental emergency protocols, which meant Buffalo Trace had to deploy containment booms, hazmat teams, and river remediation crews. So let that sink in. Buffalo Trace became a bourbon hazmat site. Crews were literally skimming whiskey off of the river. These were not random barrels. Many were aging stocks destined to become Blanton Single Barrel, Eagle Rare 10-year, Colonel E.H. Taylor Bottled and Bond, experimental mash bill aging trials, future limited releases that never existed. Entire rickhouse floors of long aging inventory vanished in minutes. This permanently altered Buffalo Trace's aging pipeline. You can't replace aged whiskey. You can only wait another decade. That lost whiskey is one of the hidden reasons why Blanton started tightening globally, why Eagle Rare allocations thinned in the 2010s, why E.H. Taylor became harder to find than it had any right to be. The shortages didn't hit immediately. They showed up years later when those barrels were supposed to come of age and simply weren't there. After the tornado, Buffalo Trace rebuilt with reinforced rickhouse construction, redesigned barrel stacking systems, new drainage and containment planning, expanded flood and wind mitigation spacing, environmental spill controls built into the property. Many of the modern rickhouses you see today are direct descendants of this disaster. This tornado is why one of the invisible forces of why certain Buffalo Trace labels are allocated. Certain releases vanished permanently. Some limited editions exist only because protected stocks survived. Some batches taste slightly different than their predecessors. You aren't just watching weather that night. You're watching future unicorn bottles being erased from existence. And the bourbon world is still feeling it. Jim Beam's warehouse collapsed in 2019 when bourbon poisoned a river. So they were near the Kentucky River, in Kentucky, obviously. This was June 22nd, 2019. This was Jim Beam. They lost about 45,000 barrels. The environmental impact overall was over 23 miles of river contaminated. After weeks of intense rainfall in central Kentucky, the ground surrounding one of Jim Beam's aging rickhouses became saturated. Beneath the warehouse, soil erosion began to undermine the foundation, slowly at first and then catastrophically. In the early morning hours of June 22nd, 2019, the rickhouse collapsed. The structure folded in on itself like a domino stack. Thousands of barrels were crushed, split open, and thrown directly down the embankment into a feeding the Kentucky River. Within minutes, 45,000 barrels of aging bourbon were flowing into public waterways. The ethanol spill was so large that dissolved oxygen levels in the river plummeted. Fish and aquatic life suffocated. Massive fish kills were reported downstream, triggering an official environmental emergency response. Containment booms were deployed, water quality alerts were issued, wildlife agencies stepped in, and for the first time in modern bourbon history, a whiskey spill was treated like a chemical containment event. Because it was. This was not just a spill, it was a liquid oxygen displacement disaster. Jim Beam was hit with over $600,000 in environmental fines, mandatory remediation requirements, long-term monitoring orders, and new regulations for rickhouses built near waterways. Thousands of barrels had to be destroyed, barrels that had already been aging for years and were destined to be for future Knob Creek, Booker's, Baker's, and Beam single barrel programs. That whiskey didn't just disappear, it erased years of future releases. This collapse permanently altered Jim Beam's aging inventory curve. So that means certain age stated programs had to be thinned. Some batches were blended younger than intended. Some special releases were delayed, reworked, and quietly canceled. New rickhouses were moved farther from water sources. Draining and foundation engineering standards were permanently rewritten. This is one of the reasons why Beam Suntory modern warehouses now include reinforced foundations, runoff capture systems, and spill containment engineering that didn't exist before 2019. So you didn't just lose bourbon that day. You lost years of future Knob Creek 12+, Booker's experimental stock, and private barrel programs that were supposed to exist and never did. It was the day bourbon became an ecological hazard, and the river still remembers. Wild Turkey lightning fire in 2000, when the hills of Lawrenceburg burned. So obviously this was in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. The distillery was Wild Turkey, and this was the summer of 2000. In the summer of 2000, a severe electrical storm moved across Anderson County, Kentucky. During the storm, lightning struck one of Wild Turkey's aging rickhouses located on the wooded hills surrounding their Lawrenceburg distillery, an area packed with barrel storage and dense vegetation. The lightning strike immediately ignited the warehouse. But unlike a normal structure fire, this one became something far more violent. Inside the rickhouse were thousands of aging barrels filled with high-proof bourbon. As heat rapidly built inside the structure, alcohol vapors pressurized the barrels until they ruptured. Burning bourbon poured from the collapsing warehouse and ran downhill into the surrounding brush and forest. Fire crews described flames moving through vegetation as if gasoline had been poured over the hillside. Entire sections of woods ignited. Fire spread faster than crews could contain. The warehouse was completely destroyed, and thousands of barrels were lost. Whiskey that had already been aging for years. And these weren't young barrels. Much of the inventory was destined to become future Wild Turkey 101 age-stated stock, rare breed blending reserves, long-aging barrels for future Russell's reserve programs, and experimental aging trials. Entire layers of aging inventory vanished in one night. The fire forced Wild Turkey to redesign lightning protection systems, increase spacing between rickhouses, rethink how warehouses were placed near forested areas, install modern fire suppression engineering, and expand runoff containment planning. These changes still shape Wild Turkey's rickhouse layout today. Because of this fire, certain Wild Turkey releases were reformulated. Some experimental barrels were permanently lost. Some long-term aging programs were delayed. Allocation pressure quietly increased years later. This fire didn't make headlines for long, but it erased a future generation of bourbon, quietly, permanently, and completely. Mother Nature didn't just strike a building. She struck Wild Turkey's timeline. Barton's 1792 warehouse collapses. 2018 and 2021. The distillery with Rickhouse karma. Location, Bardstown, Kentucky. This distillery was the Barton 1792, and there was a collapse in 2018 on June 22nd, 2018, and another collapse in 2021 on December 11th, 2021. Total barrels lost, 27,000 plus barrels. The first collapse in 2018 is what we're going to talk about first. After prolonged heavy rainfall in Nelson County, the ground beneath one of Barton's hillside rickhouses began to shift. The foundation weakened quietly until the building finally gave way. The rickhouse collapsed completely. 18,000 barrels crashed downhill into nearby creeks and drainage systems. Bourbon poured directly into local waterways. Containment booms had to be deployed. Fish kills were reported. State and federal environmental agencies opened investigations immediately. Thousands of barrels were destroyed, barrels that had already been aging for years and were scheduled for future 1792 foolproof, small batch, bottle and bond, and experimental releases. 3 years later, with many of the same environmental and structural conditions, it happened again. Another Barton rickhouse collapsed in December 2021. 9,000 additional barrels were lost. Once again, bourbon flowed into local creeks. Once again, emergency crews were deployed. Once again, EPA investigations followed. And, once again, years of future whiskey simply disappeared. This made Barton the only major Kentucky distillery in modern history to suffer 2 catastrophic rickhouses collapses within one aging cycle. They were aging stock destined for the 1792 small batch, bottle and bond, foolproof, private selection barrels, and long-term experimental aging trials. After the second collapse, Barton was forced to redesign rickhouse foundations, increase drainage and hillside reinforcement, add runoff containment systems, revise environmental compliance standards, and shift where aging stock could be placed. Some aging strategies were permanently abandoned because the land itself proved unstable. They lost years of future bourbon. Twice. Some 1792 releases are tighter today not because of hype, but because entire rickhouses physically slid off the timeline. Gravity won. Twice. Maker's Mark flooding in 2010. I call this when the bourbon tried to float away. It's in Loretto, Kentucky, the Maker's Mark Distillery, in May 2010. So in the spring of 2010, historical rainfall hammered central Kentucky, causing creeks and low-lying valleys to overflow. Maker's Mark, built along Star Hill Farm in flood-prone hollow, found several of its aging rickhouses partially submerged as floodwaters rushed through the property. This was not a surface puddle. Water rose into the lower floors of the rickhouses. Wooden bourbon barrels float. So as floodwater entered the rickhouses, thousands of barrels shifted, lifted, and moved out of their original stacking positions. Some floated just enough to break seals. Others partially submerged and reabsorbed water through the barrel staves. When the water receded, distillery crews discovered something far worse than lost barrels. Proof levels had changed unpredictably. Some barrels gained water, some lost alcohol, some became chemically unstable, meaning their contents could no longer be legally sold as bourbon. Those barrels just had to be dumped entirely. Years of aging bourbon just disappeared down the drain. These were barrels destined to become Maker's Mark, Maker's 46, and early experimental stave finishing trials, long-aging private selection barrels. Entire flavor profiles that were supposed to exist simply vanished. The flood forced Maker's Mark to change lower floor barrel placement strategies, raise barrel storage levels, redesign drainage around rickhouses, modify how proof drift is managed, and adjust blending techniques to maintain consistency. Some post-2010 Maker's batches required different blending recipes because the original aging stock that would have been used simply wasn't there. Yes, Floodwater quietly rewrote Maker's Mark's flavor math. And Maker didn't just lose those barrels, they lost entire future taste profiles. Some of the Makers you drink today taste the way it does because other barrels drowned. The bourbon Titanic sank in silence. Old Crow Distillery Fire in 1878, the fire that nearly ended a legend. Again in Frankfort, Kentucky, Old Crow, 1878, the entire distillery and aging stock. It was a financial impact, millions of 1800s dollars, equivalent to tens of millions today. Long before allocations, bottle hype, or collector culture, Old Crow is the king of bourbon. Founded in the early 1800s and made famous by Colonel James Crow, the distillery was producing some of the most widely distributed whiskey in America. Its aging warehouses were filled with stock, destined to supply bars, taverns, and stores for years to come. Then came 1878. A massive fire, likely sparked by a combination of wooden rickhouse construction, open flames, and high-proof whiskey vapors, engulfed the entire distillery. The fire spread so quickly that almost nothing could be saved. Virtually all aging stock was destroyed. Barrels that had been aging for decades, whiskey earmarked for the national market, experimental and high-quality reserves used to define Old Crow's reputation. The distillery itself was reduced to ruins, production was halted, employees lost their jobs, and the financial toll nearly bankrupted the company. Millions of dollars in the 19th century money were lost, which would be tens of millions in today's terms. In this fire, this was more than a brand disaster. It reshaped Old Crow's future production strategy. It demonstrated the risk of rickhouse construction and fire management. It influenced Kentucky bourbon economics for decades as distillers realized that aging inventory was extremely vulnerable. It reinforced the need for safety protocols, spacing, and insurance, lessons later applied by Heaven Hill, Buffalo Trace, Wild Turkey, and virtually every distillery. Some historians argue this fire slowed Old Crow's dominance and created an opening for other brands, like Early Times and Jim Beam, to rise in the 1800s. Old Crow survived, but the trajectory of the brand and Kentucky bourbon itself had been permanently altered. This wasn't just lost whiskey. It was a lesson to the entire industry. Bourbon is precious, aging is vulnerable, and the sky literally could fall on your barrels. Every time we chase dusty Old Crow bottles today, we're chasing what almost didn't survive in 1878. So why this matters for bourbon hunters? It's the invisible hand of disaster. Every fire, flood, tornado, or collapse we've discussed didn't just destroy whiskey. It reshaped the bourbon world in ways you can taste, see, and chase decades later. These disasters are the hidden reasons behind why certain years are rare. Entire production runs disappeared overnight. When you see a 1996 Heaven Hill or a pre-2010 Maker's Mark release, You're often drinking the survivors of catastrophic events that wiped out hundreds of thousands of barrels. Why lost barrel myths exist. Those stories aren't exaggeration. Some barrels were literally buried under debris, swept away in floods, or vaporized in explosions. The surviving barrels became legends. Why some brands vanished for decades. Old Crow nearly vanished after 1878. Barton 1792 had 2 Rickhouse collapses in 3 years. When production stops suddenly, it can take years or decades to recover. Why allocations suddenly tighten years later. Whiskey can't be hurried. If a warehouse burns, floods, or collapses, the age state of products that were supposed to exist simply aren't there. Supply bottlenecks happen years after the event. Why certain batches taste weirdly magical. Surviving barrels from disasters often age differently, exposed to smoke, heat, floodwater, or altered microclimates. Sometimes these accidents create flavor profiles that collectors swear are impossible to replicate. Some of the bottles you hunt exist because entire rickhouses died for them. Bourbon doesn't just age in barrels. Sometimes it survives disasters. And the survivors, those are the bottles that become legend. Every sip you take may be tasting history itself. The burned, the flooded, and the vanished. It's why bourbon hunting isn't just collecting bottles. It's chasing the story of a survival in a world built from wood, fire, and water. And that's a wrap, Bourbon Hunters. Today we've seen how fires, floods, lightning, tornadoes, and collapsing warehouses didn't just destroy whiskey, they created legends. Some of the bottles you chase exist because entire rickhouses died for them. Thank you for joining me for this Bourbon Hunter Anonymous therapy session, a safe place to nerd out over bourbon disasters, laugh a little, and maybe feel a tiny bit better about all the crazy things that happen behind the scenes of our favorite spirit. Remember, bourbon doesn't just age in barrels. Sometimes it survives disasters. And what's left? That's what becomes legendary. Well, hunters, we drink another episode and survived the bourbon jungle. And if you're still reading subtitles with a glass in hand, you're exactly who we're hunting for. Before you wander off, do me a solid. Smash that like button, subscribe, comment that you love me, and ring the bell like it's happy hour. Every click helps us prove that bourbon curiosity isn't just a hobby, it's a lifestyle. Share our channel with your fellow hunters, leave a comment with your take, and join the conversation, because every bourbon hunter story adds flavor to the mix. And remember, out here in Bourbon Hunter Anonymous, we celebrate the good, the bad, and the deliciously barreled age. Life's too short for bad bourbon or skip therapy sessions. Stay thirsty, stay sneaky, pour responsibly. Session adjourned. Cheers to the hunt.